welcome. This is In the Evening with Ike Kruchler. There comes a day when most little boys grow out of burning anthills with magnifying glasses. But for some, that day doesn't come. Instead, comes a day of joyous excitement when they realize they can make a career out of it. Tommy Mullardoch made a career out of it. He ran what was, for a while anyway, the most successful bug bombing business his neck of the woods had ever seen. He and his boys did everything under the sun that had wings and pincers and too many legs. Wasps, ants, termites, gone. Those guys were good at it. So good they almost ran themselves right out of business. That's the problem sometimes. You help too many people with the problem they swear they'll never have twice. Sooner or later, you're out of options. Tommy Mullardoch found himself in that sort of situation one day. And though you might not think of it, Tommy was smart. Or at least, just smart enough to think his way out of it. For a little while. The fact was, people's houses in his area weren't getting infested with termites or anything anymore. The area had seen a housing boom lately. The hands of fate had moved, and more rich people were building more and more nice, fancy houses in his neck of the woods. It's not that this type of house is immune to bug infestations. It's just that it can take a bit for the bugs to catch up to most of them. Any cracks or crevices that creepy crawlies might come in through might take a little longer to develop. And Tommy, bless his heart, couldn't wait that long. Maybe he could have been more careful running his business in the past. Maybe he could have made some better choices, wasted less time and money, planned for rainy days instead of playing in the sunshine. He found himself slumped in a Great Depression, unable to take his mind off of his own failures. He was running a failing exterminator business. If only he'd somehow left a couple ants in a couple houses he'd hit in the past. A surviving Adam and Eve that could have brought forth a strong and powerful generation of new ants, tougher than the last. A challenge he and his men could overcome and reap the rewards of. He swore as the doldrums ran on that if he ever got the chance to exterminate one more time before the money ran out and his business folded, he'd leave at least a few insects alive as insurance. He was half kidding when he thought that to himself. Only half. And the thought, like a roach living under his sink, kept popping up and darting away when he least expected it, driving him mad with the suggestion of it, daring him to pursue. The idea multiplied in his mind, infesting every fold of his brain, crawling in his veins. It evolved into something more potent. Before he even knew what he was doing, Tommy, on one gloomy night, went to a pet store one town over and made a purchase. He bought 3 little plastic containers full of live crickets, the kind people buy to feed lizards with. It barely cost him $2. $2, just to entertain the idea. Maybe give it a moment's thought. Maybe he would. Maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he'd drive all the way home, leave the crickets in the containers, and put them on his shelf. Watch them die out, eat each other and starve. Maybe, and this was a big maybe, the kind of maybe he'd only prod at for fear of admitting it, even to himself. Maybe he'd take a stroll down one of those affluent neighborhoods full of shiny new houses 3 times the size of his own, sporting backyards that glowed bright green all year round through a haze of sprinkler water that lit up with rainbows if you caught them at the right angle. Maybe he'd waltz right up to one of those houses, chosen at random, of course, walk outside till all the lights were off, peek in through an open window, wait till all was quiet, then shake up one of those containers and dump all the crickets inside. Let them roam around some. Have the time of their little lives in a real mansion. Let them have the run of the place all night till Mr. and Mrs. Warbucks upstairs wake up in the morning and find their home overrun, or better yet, let them wake up in the middle of the night to incessant chirping, The endless call and answer of countless little Romeos asking their Juliets if they'd fancy a dance by the family portraits on the marble mantelpiece, perhaps a roll in the hay in the lady of the house's delicates drawer. Then the overwhelmed man and wife upstairs, now house guests to an insect colony in what is surely by now one big hive, reach blindly in the dark for their telephone and call up the nearest man who could possibly save them from the onslaught. And there would be Tommy, waiting on the other end of the line, ready for battle, ready to fly in wearing shining armor. Needless to say, Tommy did it. He dumped the crickets in some poor somebody's house and drove home in a rush. And in the morning, the call came, and he answered after one ring, and he knew just what to do. And he went home that day with the money in his pocket, a song in his heart, a spring in his step like he was hopping around on cricket legs. By the end of the month, he'd done this 6 times, and on each instance, he came just in the nick of time and left not a trace of the biblical locust plague he had, unbeknownst to the paying customers, smote them with himself. Each time he and his men pulled off a perfect job and were paid handsomely with Tommy's new rates, all for the price of gas and a couple dollars worth of live pet food. Now he was earning, and he was truly earning, off of his own efforts, off of his proactivity, his genius, controlling and dominating the very insects he stamped on with an Old Testament power and fury. He was out of the rut. He woke up each day with a secret that burned in his heart and in his furnace, and powered his car and heated the food he could put on the table with his bug money. Tommy was riding on a wave of dead crickets, but every wave reaches the shore eventually and crashes against it in a froth of angry foam. Tommy was smart, but he wasn't smart enough to see it coming. One night, when Tommy was creeping up to somebody's house to deposit the bugs, he turned on a motion sensor, set off a security light, and, becoming suddenly aware of the predicament, he tried to leave, stumbled backwards and crashed into a bush. The sound woke up the family inside, who rushed out just in time to see a man trundling off into the dark, a mound of crickets writhing on their patio in his wake. At least in his excitement, he managed to take with him the plastic container clearly labeled with the name of the pet shop. That was the only saving grace. He ran home red with shame, worried crickets squirming around in his shirt pocket and wiggling around his belt line. When he got home that night, he wished he was dead. Surely the jig was up. It was too dangerous to do this again. Maybe the family wouldn't think twice about the crickets. Maybe they wouldn't put 2 and 2 together. But maybe they would. And if he was caught, which, since he was targeting neighborhoods with clientele who could clearly afford security cameras, seemed abundantly likely now that he really thought about it, he could be in serious trouble. He lay low for a while. But Tommy was a thinker, and as he lay low for the next 5 weeks without a job in town, he couldn't stop the relentless thinking. And as he thought, he studied and researched and planned and abandoned plans and vexed and tried again and again to stop himself from hatching his next scheme. But when Tommy emerged from this fugue state, he had a destination. He drove over state borders to get there, and when he got there, he operated with extreme caution and secrecy. He had found a breeder of most unusual insects and zeroed in on one species that really caught his eye. An exotic roach, a rare one. $600 for an egg sack the breeder gave him in a brown paper sandwich bag with very specific instructions on how to keep them and how not to keep them. Tommy took notes and left, floating on a cloud. $600 was a lot, but pennies compared to what he could reap from it. He could be in the papers for this. The lone hero that stopped the U.S.'s first invasion of this singular and colorful species that most people had never heard about. As he drove home, after a while he started hearing noises from the paper bag in his passenger seat. Sounds of tiny legs on thin paper, crawling around in the dark. trying to find a home, trying to find food. Tommy grinned as he heard it. He raised them for 3 days, left them in a terrarium with gauze wrapped tightly in layers over the top. He misted them frequently and checked hourly on their development. There were hundreds in there, and they were growing fast. He left a slab of beef in the terrarium for them to eat. They only ate carrion, and ate voraciously. By the end of the 2nd day, they were each an inch long, and had greatly decreased in population. He had expected this. They weren't known to be very successful in this kind of climate. That was good, though. Only the strong would live. By the 3rd day, they had long finished the beef, worked through the corpses of their dead, and began eating each other alive. It was survival of the fittest, and they were starting to chew through the gauze. He knew it was time. He had cased a perfect house for the event. A young husband and wife, both worked late, giving him ample time to set up what he needed to. No cameras. No house alarm. There were security lights, but that was fine. No one would be home. After the sun set, while they were gone, he crept around the back of the house and climbed onto their roof. He pried open an attic window. Inside, it was dusty and dark. They didn't go up here frequently. Perfect. He tossed in something he'd brought in a plastic bag, a dead squirrel. Don't ask where he got it. Fresh. They'd smell it, and they'd go crazy trying to get to it. Those little bugs would search the whole house, and since they were powerful burrowers, able to get through soft wood if they really tried, they'd make a real mess of the place. Last but not least, he took the terrarium out of his car, placed it on its side in a bush very near their basement window. The roaches were already close to getting through the gauze. To seal the deal, he shook out some of the squirrel blood from the bag inside the window, just a few drops to guide them in the right direction. It was out of his hands now. He drove home and waited for the call, vibrating with excitement. When he got up the next morning, he wanted to kick himself. Surely he had slept through the call, hadn't he? No missed calls. Maybe they hadn't come home. Maybe they'd be back soon. He waited for the afternoon. Still no call. Impatient, he drove to their street, preemptively bringing a hefty canister of pesticide ready to look like the ever-prepared man in charge that he surely was. Their cars were outside. Well, they must be home. His heart was beginning to slowly sink. He could barely wait until night. The instant the sun had set, he approached the property. He looked first in the bush. The terrarium was empty, a gaping hole chewed into the gauze. The lights were on inside, but he couldn't hear anything. Steeling himself, he rang the doorbell. If he applied himself, he could talk it through like he'd seen one outside, or had a neighbor call saying they'd spotted one on a car window or something. No answer at the door. Maybe a broken doorbell. When he tried knocking, the door swung open when he hit it. He peered inside. He was immediately hit with the smell. The bodies were found not long after, and the story remained in the papers for weeks. The terrarium upended outside, the door wide open, lights on. The smell, the stains. The young husband and wife, picked over, bones showing through the ragged flesh. The hapless exterminator, partially eaten, covered in dead bugs. At least the idiot had done one thing right. He'd opened the canister just as they swarmed him, began crawling up his clothes. He and his bugs died together. One last, successful job. The squirrel in the attic remained untouched. Tommy got what was coming to him in the end. Smart enough to get himself into trouble. Almost smart enough to get himself out of it. At least he killed the bugs, even if his last breath stunk and burned of pesticide. But But he did kill the bugs. At least, most of the bugs. That we can say with certainty. But who can really know if Tommy didn't end up sticking to his initial plan and left an Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, accidentally, in the heat of the moment? Some strong survivors. At least, if he did, that means he left a job for somebody.